This is C-SPAN's Afterwards podcast. This week, NBC News' Ryan Reilly discusses his book, Sedition Hunters, how January 6th broke the justice system. He explains how citizens helped law enforcement find individuals involved in the January 6, 2021 riot at the U.S. Capitol. He's interviewed by Politico senior legal affairs reporter Kyle Cheney.
So Ryan, it's good to be with you in this setting as opposed to the federal courthouse where we usually spend our days. And we have a lot to cover about this really remarkable book that congratulations, and glad it's finally out. Just to start with a basic question, who are the Sedition Hunters, and why did you choose to write not just a story about them as you might normally, but an entire book? Tell me about them.
You know, it's a really diverse group. They're really from across the country. Early on, I think there are a lot, even people who are overseas who are sort of involved in this on the open source side and bringing some of their sort of skills and technology to that. But really, you know, the core group that it is now are spread out all across the country, and in fact of our different political persuasions. In fact, there's a key individual I wrote about in the book who voted for Trump twice, which was sort of a surprise for a lot of the other Sedition Hunters, but really just saw what happened on January 6th, got really angry about the assault on democracy, and sort of brought the skills that they had to the table to sort of help solve a lot of these crimes, with a particular focus on the violent offenders.
Well, tell me, when did you realize that this community of sleuths, as you call them, just was going to be a significant part of this January 6th story? That we all saw the attack on January 6th. I think you and I had the same reaction. This is a flashpoint in American history that deserves to be covered inside and out to understand what happened. The sleuths, though, are a very discrete subset of that story. And when did you realize they were going to matter so much, and decide to write this book?
I think it built over a few months, but my first sort of entry into it actually involved a woman who was just sentenced this week, Rachel Powell. She's a mother of 8, grandmother of 6, who's in her 40s, and she was wearing a pink hat and was known as Bullhorn Lady. And very early on in the first days after this, there were some irresponsible sort of social media speculation, similar to sort of what we saw after the Boston Marathon bombing, for example, where people were just throwing out these ideas. But very quickly, the community sort of coalesced around these rules, is that we don't throw out names just willy-nilly. We don't put them out there if we're not sure about them. We send things into the FBI. So that sort of all came about. But the way this really started out with Rachel Powell was that I sort of had made an offhand Twitter joke, as I am sometimes want to do, and mentioned that because she was leading around this group of rioters, saying, hey, we should probably coordinate together to take the building over a bullhorn. She sort of had a tone that reminded me of sort of someone leading a tour, or perhaps a chaperoning an 8th grade trip of the Capitol, and like sort of a little bit flustered, a little bit of that tone that I sort of knew as a parent, where you're kind of like, all right, at the end of your rope, hey guys, and I just sort of thought it was funny, so I said, $20 says this ends in both criminal charges and a PTA resignation. So she's a homeschooler. I was a little bit off, but ultimately that's what I got a tip that really brought me into this community, because I got a tip from this mysterious account saying, hey, we've identified her, we're trying to figure out what to do. But the frustration there is that there was all this energy of the community focused on this, and getting that message out that this person has been identified, but not necessarily setting off any sort of doxing or setting off any sort of, something that could mess up this investigation, because she was still out there, right? So ultimately, Ronan Farrow beat me to that story, but I sort of, sucked it up and said, I'll get the next one, and then ended up working on the Danny Rodriguez story, and identifying the individual who drove a stun gun into Officer Mike Fanone's neck, which is really the first major story that I wrote. It was based on this work.
And I want to get into that one more later, but I am curious, sort of, the Sedition Hunters, as you describe them, the sleuths, have become sort of this adjunct, essentially, of the FBI. And the book, I think, details in a really remarkable way the sort of modern history of the FBI and a lot of their failings in this arena and dealing with modern technology. And so the sleuths kind of seem to have arisen as a consequence of that, of the FBI's, the cumbersome bureaucracy of it. And so how did you tell me about the community? How it came together? Are these people that work in concert? Are there multiple groups? Are they split? Do they all get along? Do they know who each other are? Do you know who they are?
I know who some of them are. Some of them I only really know by their handles and their history. What's nice about this is both the FBI. What's nice about this for both the FBI and for me is that I can check this, right? I can check the work. I can look at what they did, work this backwards, find the connections, and make sure that these are accurate, because they just can send you everything where they show up. Here's where we made this connection. There's someone being sentenced this week named Airhead Lady with her son, who was known as Airhead Boy, because they had worn these emergency escape hoods as they left the Capitol building. And that was a case where the FBI actually raided the wrong home. They went to a home in Alaska, knocked down this woman's door, put them in handcuffs, put her and her husband in handcuffs, and started questioning them about where Nancy Pelosi's laptop was. And that's because they thought that this woman was a woman who entered into Speaker Pelosi's office and was involved in stealing that laptop, ultimately helping get it into the backpack of another individual. And they got a human, actually, who apparently knew this woman, the wrongly accused woman, who was, I should say, at the Capitol but didn't go inside that we know of. She was just on the grounds of the Capitol with her husband, who said that, oh, yeah, that's her, right? So they got a human to say who knew her. And that's sort of one of those instances of, the human eye isn't the greatest, right, and human witnesses aren't necessarily the best. Because if you look very closely, there's just a lot of differences between those two women. They had an earlobe attached, for example, is one of the differences. And the husband actually remarked at one point, that my wife is much more attractive than this woman.
Or she'd never be caught dead wearing that outfit, right?
Correct, exactly, yeah. So that's where sort of a lot of this, as the skills that they've brought to the table have really come to bear. And that was one of the things, like one of the sleuths remarked to me, that they think that work was some of the most important they did, because it cleared, or at least helped get attention off of a woman who was wrongly accused and had her home raided by the FBI because they didn't check their facts, and they didn't really go through all of the open source ways they could do this, or do even a face check. Really, they could have just compared photos. Like, don't use your eyes. Computers are better at this. Like, run that through a match to make sure that those are the same person.
Well, and that's, so much of this book is about the use of facial recognition technology, and how, just the massive volume of video evidence of the January 6th attack. And that seems to be where the FBI just was completely in over its head, was that they don't know how to handle cases that have an enormous load of video evidence. I think you wrote about how they were still getting evidence on flash drives that couldn't hold large files, and so the sleuths didn't have the same sort of constraints. And so how did that work? How did the sleuths realize, that they could be useful to the FBI, and how did the FBI realize that the sleuths could be useful to them, and how does that relationship work to this day?
I think one thing that I was guilty of, and a lot of people were guilty of in the first days, was overestimating the FBI's capabilities, right? Because they came in with this big, strong message. I remember one of the things comments we heard in one of these early press conferences was, we do big, right? We've done this before. We got this. But if you look at what they thought the scope of this was at the very beginning, they thought there were 800 people who were going to get arrested, who were involved in this. Maybe 800 entered. That's what they were sort of looking at, the max. And now today we have 1,100, and that's only a third of the people who could be arrested. There are more than 3,000 people who could theoretically be charged based on the way that prosecutors have laid this out, which means they either entered the building or committed some sort of violence or destruction outside of the building. That's sort of where the parameters have landed at the moment. We're never going to get to that, because right now, even when you had that massive influx of resources in that first year, when most of these arrests really took place, year 2 and year 3, were probably about the same as year 1. That's not where we're going to end up in the end of this. The pace just isn't going to keep up. So now it's more about what cases are going to be prioritized, and it really is, frankly, the sleuths who are putting pressure on the FBI, being like, hey, we sent this in 2 years ago. What's going on with this one? There's a funeral home co-owner in Long Island who they just really were sort of publicly ragging the FBI about, saying,
that's
hey,
the guy with the wasp spray, right?
Correct. Yeah. And I got a tip of, that was one of the ones early on that I was like, oh no, this person's going to be arrested soon. This was 2021. And I was just like, no, this is going to be too obvious. I'll focus on another one. And then flash forward, 2.5 years later, and finally he's charged. But they were, sending out tweets saying, do you need a Google address, map to his house? Because there's just no doubt he was with his son. I mean, there was so much confirming information there.
Well, and you write about this a lot in the book. You mentioned people who have not yet been arrested, and so obviously you don't identify them by name, but you point out, things that are on video that you've seen with your own eyes, people committing violence, people committing all sorts of the worst sort of crimes that you think the Bureau and the Justice Department are prioritizing. People know who they are. They basically have verifiable, confirmable evidence, but they haven't been arrested to this day, even years after that's been surfaced. So, I mean, talk about that a little bit. Are the sleuths frustrated? Do they feel like the FBI is hearing them and values them as a resource?
I definitely think a lot of the sleuths know how valuable they are to the FBI, but they are just really frustrated by the bureaucracy, right? And there's been a lot of turnover in the more than 2.5 years since this investigation started. But, in the early days, they were really sort of sending things into this black hole and sending it into the, national tip line. And then who knows where that goes or who knows who reviews it if it's ever come back to. Because there have been cases where the sleuths later on would follow up and say, oh, hey, we've put together a case against someone, here's all the evidence, and then instead of basing it off of how the sleuths ID'd them, the FBI just went back into their database and found someone who knew that person who, on January 7th or 8th was like, hey, here's this person's info. And, you could base the case basically off of that. But I think they know how much they're appreciated, but there's definitely a growing sense of frustration with some of these cases not being brought to fruition, especially when you see all of these conspiracy theories blow up around individuals. Because we've seen some really sort of absurd out there conspiracy theories who, this person was the one really controlling this, or we're all going to blow this up if we just identify this person, right? And a lot of those people have been ID'd. There's one guy who broke a window and was pulled away by another rioter, and there are millions of people who have seen videos, and this is promoted really big on the right wing, that this guy was obviously a Fed or obviously Antifa, just 100% stated as fact. Oh, an obvious Fed, he's working for the Feds, we caught him. No idea who the guy actually is. This is a guy who I read on the book who I went to his Facebook page, still up there the other day. It's MAGA 100% all the way. He was arrested for threatening a Democratic politician before all of this blew up. Pleaded guilty in that case afterwards. And still hasn't been arrested yet by the FBI. And that's one of the sort of cases that is really frustrating because you see all this misinformation and you're sort of waiting on inaction. But meanwhile, this misinformation, this disinfo is heavily ingrained in people and who will never see the correction 2 years down the road where, no, actually that guy wasn't Antifa, as it turned out, just another Trump supporter who thought the election was stolen.
Well, that's a fairly common theme when some of these people are arrested after, like you said, those theories have been built up. But, you talked a little bit about how the sleuths view it as particularly valuable when they can knock down bad information almost as much as when they can provide good information to help ID people. There are some cases you mentioned, in one very prominent one, in which the sleuths have actually found information about crimes that were committed by particular rioters after they'd already been charged and even convicted or pleaded guilty to lesser charges. One of the ones that comes to mind is Zach Reil, a member of the Proud Boys, who was charged with seditious conspiracy, which is one of the gravest crimes charged. But talk about this episode emerged in trial, so I wonder if you could talk about that and how the sleuths played a role.
Yeah, and this is one of those ones that is, it was for the defense attorney, essentially, what happened was we were going into a long weekend. They were directly examining Zachary Reil on the bench, and they didn't want a situation where Zachary Reil was going to be questioned by prosecutors on cross-examination just before the weekend and then have that sitting in jurors' heads for a long weekend. That wasn't going to be beneficial. They wanted the last thing that jurors heard to be a very sympathetic sort of portrayal of Reil, talking about his background and the things that he would talk about on direct examination from his own attorney. And because of that decision to sort of spread things out and really just kill a day, essentially, the sleuths got to work. And over a long weekend, were able to surface images that show Zachary Reil with a can of pepper spray spraying officers, and that was something that emerged from another case, public video that was put out because it was released in connection with another case, and they were able to spot that.
Well, and it's so amazing because one of the sub themes of the Proud Boys trial, again, probably the most serious trial of all January 6th riot-based trials, was that there's no evidence that they committed any violence or limited evidence that there was any physical violence committed by any of these men on trial, and it took them a weekend when they realized they had that one last opportunity to completely undercut that entire narrative and catch what in my view looked like Zach Reil unaware on the stand that they would even surface this evidence. And
after he leaned in hard, very hard to, I did not assault anyone, and just, there it goes. And it really is just astonishing that, that was one of the most serious investigations of this entire matter, and that was something that the FBI managed to miss. And I think it's just because they're not good at organizing this video behind the scenes.
Well, and a lot of your book, and it's one of the things that surprised me about it, in a good way. I mean, I expected to read a lot about the sleuths, and I did, but there's also sort of a modern history of the FBI in there, and some of the reasons why they weren't necessarily equipped to do this huge post-January 6th investigation. And you know, something you pointed out was, again, the ideological history of the FBI, but also their reluctance and hesitation about things like domestic terrorism. Talk about how that factors in here and how that led to sort of the rise of the sleuths, I guess.
Yeah, I think there's this thing within the FBI where they're very eager to say that two things are equal. And in reality, if you look at who is killing individuals in acts of political violence, it's almost entirely on the right. That is where we see deadly political violence coming from. I'll say specifically deadly, right? Because yes, Antifa's committed a bunch of assaults. They're also not really that well organized, but it's just a different beast. If you want to look at the body count, that's where you need to really have your focus on, is the right. And I mean, it makes sense. There are just ideological differences between the left and the right. Even, you know, during the heyday of really efforts from terrorism from the left in the 1970s, when you saw bombs happening, even at the U.S. Capitol, there was really an effort not to kill anyone in a lot of those things. Those bombs really were effectively press releases, exploding press releases, as one author described them, that would happen on a constant basis. But they really were not about killing people. And I think that that's really just where we see this difference today. You know, you have one side that is very into guns and weaponry and very into 1776, and you know, where on the other side you sort of have more of a punch a Nazi sort of scenario, and it's not really more about that deadly political violence. While there are certainly deadly acts, the body count is just much higher on the right. And I think that's one of the things within the FBI that they're really struggling with, because you know, that gets really complicated, because you don't have, when you're talking about international terrorism, a contingency of, you know, Islamic extremists within the House, right? Who are going to say, you know, like support all of these, that you're going too aggressively against Islamic extremists. But as soon as you step on something on the other side, you know, all of a sudden you're getting called to the carpet and called in for a hearing if anything sort of goes out of whack. And it was just a really difficult situation they're in, because, you know, obviously Trump is driving a lot of this political violence. We saw that time and time again, where Trump's rhetoric really did amp people up, and was, and you know, and we saw that with the bombs that were mailed to by Cesar Sayoc, a strip club bouncer who was mailing off bombs to all of Trump's enemies. So you see these events, but they can't really talk honestly about this, and it just sort of, you know, before January 6th, it seems sort of obvious that if you convince a bunch of people that the election was stolen and say this is the last moment to save their country, some of them are going to do some pretty stupid things.
Right, and you get at some of the I mean, the FBI itself as an organization was sort of, you know, politically sympathetic to the right historically, and so, you know, it's in some ways it's almost comical that they're now portrayed as sort of being these sort of ultra lefties who wanted to subvert, you know, prevent you know, Trump or in a wrongful way prevent Trump from winning re-election or hurt his chances. But then, you know, you talk about the Bureau as, you know, they're just general discomfort going after domestic terrorists because of the Americans are entitled to constitutional protections that international terrorists don't have.
Right.
So I guess how does that, you know, how did the sleuths help get around some of that internal, that bureaucratic problem that they face, where there actually are legitimate constitutional issues when you are targeting Americans, you know, over very politically sensitive crimes? Yeah,
and a lot of the rhetoric that is sort of commonly used even is somewhat violent in a lot of scenarios, you know, targeting and all sorts of words that are used around, you know, fight like hell, for example, really that's protected speech, right? Because that doesn't necessarily mean a physical violent fight. You're not saying attack, you know, there's just a lot of language that we use in politics that really is in this sort of in-between area. And the FBI was just overwhelmed with the volume of that ahead of January 6th. You know, the day before January 6th, they had, I think, you know, 10,000 tips come in, 5,000 of which had to do with political speech. And that amount was like triple of what they normally had gotten, say, a couple years earlier on an average day. So just really an overwhelming amount of information. But the way they approached that was by talking about, sort of lone wolves and individual circumstances. So if someone said something really awful and violent, they would look at that individual specifically. Maybe they would go talk to that person and rule out that person as a specific threat. And that's really the way that they were thinking of this, as sort of a lone wolf scenario, not realizing the power of the mob and the power of organizing a mob on a specific date, on a specific time, with a specific purpose, and how that would sort of bring this coalition together. Because, the FBI had done this sort of red cell activity just before the election, about a week before the election, where they sort of speculated on what the scenarios could be if the election had been disputed. And just imagine trying to have that conversation within the FBI, right? Your boss is really Donald Trump, ultimately. You're part of the executive branch. And you can't really speak honestly about the obvious consequences of this. A couple weeks earlier, he's saying, stand back and stand by to the Proud Boys. Are you going to write a memo that says what the president is doing is a danger to national security? Get ready to get called into Congress for that one, right? Like, if you write about January 6th being this looming threat and the president's organizing this and really pushing this and really motivating a lot of people to violence, that's just really that's going to backfire on you very quickly. So you have to talk about this all speculatively and with this sort of both sidesism that doesn't exist. Just the one moment that really crystallized it for me is last year, the January 6th committee was questioning this top FBI intelligence official at the Washington field office and saying, they're talking about the December 19th tweet from Trump, "will be wild," that obviously inspired a lot of this, really got people moving. And she conceded that, as it got closer to January 6th, we saw a lot more heated rhetoric. And then there was a pause, and then she added, on both sides. And let's just be frank about this. There was not militant Joe Biden supporters who were plotting to storm the U.S. Capitol to overturn an election won by their preferred candidate. That just doesn't make a lot of sense at all. But there's this very instinctual thing, almost like they feel compulsively obligated to be like, oh yeah, on both sides, we're looking at this. And it's just not the reality, but it's this really strange situation that we're in.
Is there any evidence that you've seen that the FBI has adapted, learned, changed at all throughout the course of this investigation, either through their experience with the sleuths and seeing how they operate successfully in this arena, or just in general as an institution based on some of those blind spots that you identified?
I think we saw in the Washington field office specifically, we saw a lot of new leadership come in within that first year after January 6th. We also saw a new intelligence official in a higher capacity, sort of one of the only positions, I think, within the country that they elevated. It's sort of, in the weeds within the FBI, but they elevated someone to a different position that created a different position, essentially, to worry about intelligence, specifically focused on the Washington region. So I think, obviously, realizing that they were sort of caught flat-footed here and that they needed to make sure that they had a better awareness of what was happening. And I think the disconnect between what's happening within the FBI and what's happening online is just huge, but it really does get complicated and dicey when you're talking about what is protected free speech. If someone is even just a supporter of ISIS, for example, you can't even retweet something. That you could actually charge someone with material support for say retweeting something on their behalf. There are just more protections, and as there should be for protected speech. But it's just a lot easier to pursue these cases and have a reason to investigate someone who might be supportive of a group like ISIS than it is, for supporting your local militia or something along those lines, which, depending on your state, you might have some legal protection there if you're forming a militia.
So I want to ask you about the app and whatever you're able to say about it. But,
sure.
The sleuths, as you refer to it several times in the book, rely on an app where they basically have assembled their own database of evidence against people who are in the riot. I don't know if it's open source or they're just accumulating as much as they can and use that to help track different people in the throughout that were there on January 6th and find some of the evidence they're ultimately turning over. What is the app? How does it work? Have you seen it?
Yeah, there's a few different tools that they've used to sort of access a lot of these more open source information. I think there's a few main ones that they really focus on.
Who built this sort of primary app that they use?
Sure, there's an individual referred to as Alex, who was one of the people really who was pushing this. And I think a lot of them have just really brought a really unique skill set and can really. It allows them essentially to access information that is already publicly available online very quickly. So you have a lot of these backups of all the videos. So if you posted anything from January 6th, they've probably already got it in their database, and that's just all backed up on public websites that you can access and go into these things. So it's just a way of, I think, servicing the material that is within those public websites, or quickly going to a video, where's this moment? That's sort of what they've been able to bring to the table with some of these tools that they develop in the background.
Alex was a Trump supporter, right?
Yeah.
If I remember right from the book.
Yeah.
And as you pointed out, like some of these are not ideological. You can't typecast these people as they're just people living in their mom's basement who are anti-Trump.
Very successful people. Like that's like rich family lives, like very successful people who are involved in this. And there was someone who cracked who was involved very deeply in this. I think sort of in a heated exchange at one point. Someone sort of, saying like, what losers these people were. And they're like, I make more money than you and I work in cancer research. Like it is this very, I think there's this, again, it's sort of this Hollywood image of what you would think of the FBI versus the Hollywood image, or versus the reality of the FBI, compared with this sort of outdated, I think, idea of nerds, right?
Or
like this outdated of
people who know how to use the internet.
That's a really marketable skill in this day and age that actually can make you a lot of money. And I think that's one of the problems that the FBI is facing, in addition to the fact that you cannot smoke pot when you're a member of the FBI.
Right.
There's just a lot of these limitations that are really setting them back, because you're going to have to take a big pay cut if you want to join the FBI if you're a really technologically skilled person. And are you going to stay in for all those 20 years when okay, sure, you get that, you're going to be paid a portion of your salary for the rest of your life, and then you can get another job, and then that becomes a thing. That's sort of the typical thing with the FBI, where you stay in for 20 years, and then you get that pension, and then you get another job on the side. But in the tech world, that doesn't necessarily make the most sense, because your most marketable skills are probably today, right? You got to get in these companies early. The FBI doesn't have stock options to be handing out to folks. It doesn't have really cool campuses that people want to go to. In fact, you might be sent anywhere in the country. That it doesn't. It's really, the FBI, I think, is facing a lot of hiring challenges. I just even think just with my family or with anyone else's, if you were to sign up for a job that said, hey, they could send us anywhere, just imagine how your spouse would react to that. And also the salary is not that great, right? They could just and we're gonna maybe have to live somewhere we don't want to live, not in the place we prefer to. You could be sort of anywhere, and it's a tougher, I think, road for them to recruit, especially on the tech side.
Of course, and then and so just returning to the app, it organizes this video in a way that I think. I mean, is it really just a clearinghouse, or can they actually use it to comb through and identify people who, maybe the FBI has some evidence on them, but they can find them in other locations, other spots at the Capitol, and use that to sort of supplement the evidence the FBI may or may not already have?
I think it's mostly, like, everything that it pulls from is public, so it's just more like pulling from what is available online. But I think you can see it sort of in some of the sentencing memos and whatnot, where they're like, at this moment, on this moment, blah, 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 blah. You can, when I read a lot of those affidavits, I'm like, I can sort of see the hand of the sleuths sort of moving behind this, even if they're not directly cited, because the government isn't finding random videos on the internet at a specific time,
right?
Without that.
It's interesting. Sometimes they're very explicit about acknowledging. We have a confidential human source who who isn't connected to anyone in this case, but they're just open source researchers, and they'll cite them explicitly in the government filings. And other times they're more opaque about it and kind of say, that they use euphemisms about where they got the information from. Is there a consistency? Like, do you have a sense of why they do it a certain way sometimes and not at others?
I think it just varies on the field office that's handling these, and I think there have been instances where they probably showed a little bit more than I think the sleuths would want necessarily, right? Where it's just sort of obvious on the face of it. There have definitely been screw-ups on the FBI side that sort of showed probably more, I think, than the sleuths are necessarily comfortable with. But obviously there are some of these individuals who have officially signed up or are on the tab. But there's a lot of the world is just a lot larger than that. And what I sort of mentioned in here is that there is one person sort of at the center of this. Who I met with very early on in the process and mentioned in the book, who is really playing an essential role here in sort of organizing and getting this information to the FBI, and is willing to testify should it come to that point, because that's really what you're sort of putting on the line there. But in reality, unless there's not really much reason for logically, there's not a lot of reason for someone to have to actually testify in
Hasn't happened yet, right?
It hasn't happened yet, and like it wouldn't be of that much value, right? Because it's
the video. It's about the video.
It's the video, yeah. And it's not like they can't, like the way you can authentication is a big thing for these criminal cases, and you can, do that in a lot of different ways. Whether it shows the same scene, whether it's backdated, a lot of this information you can just vet basically on the face of it. So really, I think the only reason that you would see sort of this pursued was because, a defense lawyer sort of had an axe to grind rather than it really actually has to undermine the case. Because it's just publicly available evidence that anyone, journalist, the FBI, can vet on their own and independently confirm.
You mentioned at one point, I think early in the book, that the FBI was pretty aware of your own communications with the sleuths, and were, I guess, maybe worried that if they were also simultaneously feeding the bureau and feeding you, that it could somehow influence some of the ongoing cases. Did you find that made it harder for you to get talk to some of these people? They were less willing to be forthcoming with you because of their own relationships with the FBI?
Somewhat, but there's also that tension between them and the FBI, right? They aren't completely on the same page, and they're really frustrated by a lot of this. There's a mention, Alex mentions at one point that we're all going to be really pissed when we learn what was going on here, because there's just a lot of things that don't make sense behind the scenes and don't seem to really add up for why there are these delays. And I think there are just a number of different factors for why these cases haven't been brought forward. But it's definitely really frustrating because we're getting to a point where there are going to be people who, when January 6, 2026 comes around and the statute of limitations expires, are going to, get away with it, right? And I think that's, especially for the violent ones, that's something that the sleuths really want to prevent, because I think the way that they think about this is that you're going to have millions of people who believe a crazy conspiracy theory about the 2020 election, who believe that the election is stolen, and no amount of reason or logic is ever going to break through with them. So the only thing that you can really do is make sure that those people who believe that conspiracy theory are not going to take action on it, and make sure that they know that if they do take action on it, there are going to be consequences for that. And I think that that's what the sleuths have really concentrated on, and think of themselves as a wall as we go into 2024, when we're going to have most likely the de facto Republican candidate Donald Trump saying again that the election was stolen, and probably saying that no matter what happens, probably saying that he won in 2024. Sure.
How does someone become a sleuth, and how do these communities sort of form? Do you sense that these are people that, are there different groups? Are they different? Do they all get along? Do they trust each other? How do they become trustworthy if they don't? Do they know each other's identities, or what's your sense of that world?
They do. I mean, so there's one of my favorite moments was two individuals talking to one another, who thought they knew each other well and knew vague things about their identities. And one said, that they would be becoming a parent soon. And one of the sleuths ended up sending this individual tips on breastfeeding, only to learn that they were talking to the dad. But and now we're at the point now where they exchange Christmas cards, right? So there are people who know each other by their identities, but a lot of this has just been screen names and track records. And I don't think there have been a ton of new people who have joined since that first year. It's been that core group who really.
How many people are we talking about here in your estimation?
It's hard to say because there are a different number of groups. I say dozens is probably in the right frame. But there are different groups, and also there are different levels of dedication and activity. And some of the groups have shifted. They were in these little groupings. There's some overlap between those groups, and a lot of this is happening in sort of the apps that people use to communicate, sort of similar to Slack, right? That they just sort of have these group chats where they can all communicate and all sort of commiserate. And I think that that's an advantage that they have over the FBI as well, because you just think of the FBI sort of doing all of this via email to a field office and then waiting. The timeliness of active group communication is really essential. And I've seen that even in our own work as well. There are a ton of story ideas that I've had only from actively communicating in a group setting with a bunch of different people and just sort of throwing out something and this is, and then that sparks an idea. And you really just can't replicate that within the FBI. They have individual chats, but also everything's documented forever and turns up in discovery. And then you can't even sort of have these sort of water cooler moments to a certain extent, because all of that's going to be turned over to the defense. So you can't, there's a moment where they talk about an affair or something like that.
About the same Proud Boy we were talking about.
Yeah, and it, like, they're just sort of joking around, popcorn emoji. I don't, they say, "Oh, I got the popcorn" or something like that, and all that is turned over in Discovery.
Well, I thought that was a very interesting point. Because the link system is there, right? Their internal FBI messaging system, and everything they say there is discoverable to the defense for the most part. And
you even saw in the a few years back when they're like an FBI employee was talking to the person, like two FBI employees were talking, they later married, but they were sort of just discussing politics one-on-one in general, and all that turned up, and then it became this huge thing, made its way into an IG report. And it just is this environment where you can't talk freely, really, and you have to be so careful, because it's not because there's already so many people who believe that the FBI is really biased, but Chris Wray has really emphasized not only the making sure that we're not politically biased, but also making sure it doesn't appear as though we're politically biased, which just makes it impossible to have just open sort of conversations that you would have in other settings.
You mentioned early on that or mentioned a few times actually the sleuths sort of feeling certain responsibilities about not just doxing people, not trying to upset the FBI's cases, and trying to while helping them and being frustrated with them, not doing anything that could jeopardize a case. And I think in the book, and you mentioned this earlier in our conversation, the Boston Marathon bombing was an example where there was some footage that came out and people analyzed it, and they analyzed it very incorrectly, and it created a crisis at the time, or at least a short-lived crisis till they found the actual bombers. How did that episode shape what happened here? And then there was an interesting connection between that episode and January 6th, so I'm curious for your take on that.
Yeah, that was one of those moments where it was just like chef's kiss, right? Chef's kiss. It was perfect because I was trying to figure out a way to connect the Boston Marathon bombing and how disastrously things went there with January 6th itself. And then lo and behold, it turns out that someone who was at the press conference, who was a Boston canine officer, was in the background of a press conference, and he was, caught on camera, right? And that image of him, pretty clean face shot, showed up online. And when they sort of went to do these searches of the individual who was at the Capitol, they figured out who this was. He was a guy who's now been charged with attacking a police officer at the Capitol, inside the Capitol, with a chair. And it's just sort of really brought everything together, a good way to link this up. But yeah, I think that the Boston Marathon bombing really could have been a moment when the FBI pivoted. I was watching a documentary that came out, I think, earlier this year about the Boston Marathon bombing. And that was something, I know that that was something that the FBI learned about first via tweet, right? Like that was someone saw this come in, and then that's what sort of set everything off, and the FBI's response off, and got everything into gear. But they really struggled with the amount of incoming evidence and videos that they were receiving. They sort of put one of those things up and said, hey, everyone send us everything you got here, right? But then because that was sort of into a closed system, and then only the FBI had that, you had these people who were trying to figure this out online, wrongly accused some people, and then ultimately that's what sparked the FBI choosing to put out photos of the actual suspects, sort of basically to get the attention off of innocent people who were wrongly accused by people online, and that's what ultimately they got a tip from a family member off of, and that's what caused the arrest. But I think that there wasn't the FBI does not have the capacity that they need just to organize that kind of video behind the scenes. And I think that what they really need is basically similar to what you have on your phone, right? That's I think a good way to describe this is if you have iPhoto and you go into your iCloud library, and you swipe up on a photo, you're going to see, hey, is this that person? And then it links it to every other person, and all those videos are interconnected. And it's kind of simple technology. Millions of people have that in their pocket right now, but it's not something that the FBI has the internal capacity, or at least their tool that they do have along those lines is not up to grade.
Well, but you pointed out too that the sleuths sort of, they were aware of that episode, at least some of the ones you talked to, and viewed it as they knew that if they got it wrong, or if they had any similar blow-ups with their own assistants, that the FBI might write them off or might not take them as seriously, and sort of took it upon themselves to be thorough and accurate in a way that I think has borne out, because the FBI still leans on them very heavily. But so how aware were they that if that there was a chance that it could go very wrong, and that they could damage that entire process?
Yeah, I think early on, John Scott Railton was one individual who really was involved in these early days and sort of, setting the standard, laying out the rules, and saying we do not name people publicly online. Let's use these hashtags. Let's do this all behind the scenes. And we did. There was, over a course of probably a few months, while there's still a lot of activity of this that happens on Twitter, or at least there was until more recent changes at Twitter turning into X, organizing this sort of out in the public. But now, a lot of that did go sort of behind the scenes, where you're in these groups that are, even though you might not know everyone that's in them, or at least not publicly available to everyone in the world, that you can have internal conversations and, hey, what do you think of this? It really is sort of a peer review system almost for a lot of these sleuths, because they can challenge their preconceived biases, or challenge their if there's any errors or jumps that they made along the way that you can't really get to, and just sort of vetting it and fact checking it. And a lot of the little details, like ears are obviously, like I sort of mentioned. Freckles, tattoos, all of these things are really things that really bring these over the line, in addition to finding people if they're together. Then that's something that really checks out, because while one facial rec check might bring up someone who's not really there, although even then, if you can find them in DC, you're pretty solid, or you find evidence that they were in any way involved, where they were January 6th or January 5th or January 7th. Or going to their Venmo. It's another way of going down that line. But if you find two people together and they both have a facial rec check, and then you find them in that environment on January 6th, and then you find them in another environment completely outside of that context, you're good to go, right? Because you're not going to have two people identical who are in both environments together. That is that person.
So it's just about sort of accumulating multiple data points that can sort of increase your confidence about, identifying someone who might be blurry in one shot, but then, or they wear a mask in one shot, but then they removed it in the next one.
Exactly. With Airhead Lady, it was actually her rings, who's, she, the facial rec check was great. They went down that, then they found that was another case also where there were two together. It was her son. So then they found a bunch of images of her son when he was like a teenager. And then facial rec said that was the same person, blah, 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 go down that line. But then also just the rings that she wore, like when she's reaching for the cord on Pelosi's laptop, you can see the rings on her finger. And then you find a Facebook photo of her, say, wearing those same rings on those same fingers. And I think it was a pinky ring or something along those lines that sort of stood out.
You mentioned Airhead Lady, you mentioned the hashtags and a couple other examples. Talk to me about the importance of those monikers that the sleuths use to identify some people that maybe they've identified by their real name, maybe they haven't, but why do they use those and how are they important?
This is another case where I think where the FBI's aversion to controversy is really setting them back, because there are still people being added to the FBI's Capitol Violence webpage. And even someone like me, who is deep in the weeds on this and covering, beside people like us who are following this very regularly, how often do you go to the Capitol Violence? Right?
It's rare.
Rare, right? And they just don't pop. And you can't write a story, no news organization can write a story about number 536 added to the FBI list if all you have is this photo, and you can't say, this is what this person did. Or the nicknames is where that comes in here. With bank robbers, the FBI is comfortable doing this all the time. They'll give somebody a nickname, even if it mocks them, whatever, something that's memorable. And because they give them a nickname, you know what that does? That results in a lot of news coverage. And you know what a lot of news coverage does? Gets people identified. And it's a pretty easy process here, but they haven't done that in any of the January 6 cases, and I think it's entirely just because of politics. If you gave these people nicknames, it would blow up, right? You could just gently mock them in some way, and that would all of a sudden pop. We saw that with the woman, Pink Beret, where that was something where it was only because it was sort of funny that the FBI tweeted a photo of a woman in a pink beret that went viral. And because that went viral, somebody was standing inside of a Joanne fabric, standing in line with their buddy, and their buddy grabs their phone and says, hey, check this out. And he's like, oh my gosh, that's my ex-girlfriend, right? That's what you need, something that pops and is interesting and really gets in, people's social media feeds. And that's not something that's happening really with just these sort of, clean-cut standard number 537 has been added to the FBI's list when you don't even know what that person is.
Right, you're not going to have hashtag 537, but you will have hashtag Pippi Longscarf or hashtag Bald Eagle was a fun one, or the Swedish Scarf is one that comes up often.
Yeah.
Do you have a favorite nickname?
It's tough to say. I do think Bald Eagle, even though it doesn't work well as a hashtag, because a lot of people are just hashtagging Bald Eagle for actual photos of Bald Eagle. It's funny because the funny part is this guy in this American flag suit who was wearing almost the entire time on January 6th to the rally, etc. And like while they were attacking cops, a bald eagle face mask or just full head mask, and then at one point, during when he's in there like that, you sort of think that's funny, and then he's like really in there during the fight. But at one point, he takes it off, and it turns out he's also bald. So it worked on two levels. I thought that was kind of a funny one, although it's not the greatest hashtag in the world. But yeah, there definitely comedy is a big part of this, and that's something that I kind of, a lot of these sleuths have become friends and have these sort of really fun relationships and have a lot of laughs off of this. It's a really awful day, but it's just also there is a lot of it that's just so absurd and ridiculous. That you can't help but laugh at some of it. When you have people who are invading the U.S. Capitol who think they're invading the White House and openly saying on camera, "Here I am touching the White," it's just inherently funny.
That was, if I remember right, Doug Jensen, who I think you wrote about in the book. Were there other examples of rioters who maybe got a lot of news coverage? Maybe we know he was part of the mob that chased Eugene Goodman up the stairs. Very memorable imagery. Were there specific cases that you chose to focus on, and how did you choose which cases to focus on of the 1,000 plus that have been brought in the book?
Yeah, I think some of it just depended upon what was available and what were the most interesting stories. And the one I think of with that, which ended up in a podcast that was really well done, I think it was called "We'll Be Wild," was Danny Rodriguez, taser prick, as he was first nicknamed, the guy who drove the stun gun and who we identified about a month before he was arrested. And because of the way that case played out, and because there was a challenge about the Miranda warning that he got, and whether he was properly advised about his rights, we ended up with this video, audio transcript just of him spilling his guts to the FBI. And it was just fascinating. And the same thing with Jensen, right? That also came out through the court process, when you just have these raw materials that really give you an insight into what these people were thinking. Was I thought a good way to sort of tell the story, and something that wasn't necessarily something that a lot of people did a deep dive on. Jensen, for example, no one was reading that transcript, but I thought it was really enlightening just to hear about his life story and how he got to this point, and really raises a lot of core questions about when we're in this environment where so many people believe these sort of crazy conspiracy theories. Who's ultimately responsible for the inevitable consequences of people believing that the election was stolen, or that because it just really does seem like one of those things that you're like, of course this was going to happen if people believed this. That just what else do you think they're going to do? Do you think they're just going to go down there and hold up a little picket sign and say, oh gosh, and then when the election, when America is ruined in their mind, and they just say, oh well, get them next time, and then they think the next election is going to be rigged. You can't have a system like that where there's no trust at all in any institutions or in just basic common sense or basic reality.
Sure. And you talk about reading some of those court filings, some of the transcripts that come out. When you put this book together, and I combed through the index to see sort of, tons
100
of it,
pages.
Tons of it is based on your own interviews, your own source work over the years, and your own history covering the Justice Department. A lot of it is piecing together court filings, court transcripts from trials. Talk about the process of writing this book. How challenging was that, and how many court filings did you have to go through to piece it together?
There's a lot. I think that the story is really just sort of sprinkled in a lot of different ways. And one of the great things I think that the January 6th committee did, however you feel about their final report and what they decided to do in terms of basically, I think, in the written report and in their public hearings, giving the FBI a pretty big pass, I think. What was nice that they did is that they gave all the raw materials over. So you can sort of read all of these materials and form your own conclusions. And also, I read through thousands of pages of FBI FOIAs that haven't gotten a lot of eyeballs on them necessarily, but were dumped online, some FOIAs from DOJ as well. I think compiling that story and getting people to understand it more broadly, how this came about, it was important. I think that it ended up, the lead up to January 6th ended up being, I think, more of the book than I originally had thought. And I think that's because, I thought this was such an important story, and one that I think is still getting overlooked, because right now you're not having serious discussions within Congress about what needs to change at the FBI, how they could be doing better. There's an Inspector General investigation that's been ongoing, and maybe we'll get that before the 3-year mark, but it also could be complicated by the fact that it involves Jeffrey Clark, the former DOJ official who is very much at the center of a lot of this and was obviously charged in Georgia and is essential to the case being brought by Jack Smith against Donald Trump, I believe. You'll correct me on this, is one of the co-conspirators?
He's one of the unnamed co-conspirators. He's acknowledged himself that he is one of them.
Okay, there we go. Cleared legal. So I think that's one of the things that could, complicate this but that's, I think that this really does need some heat from members of Congress. There was a report from the Senate Homeland Security Committee earlier this year that sort of looked at some of this, but the FBI is not prepared to face the threats that it needs to in the 21st century and is not technologically where it needs to be. It has enormous challenges on the personnel level. It has enormous challenges on the tech level. And that's the reality that we're in. Like, the internet is the most important thing, right? Open source is a technology, and tracing a lot of that is the most important thing. And, as good as you can be at, DNA tests, they weren't running any DNA tests on, a lot of it was all open source video. It was video is where they need to be at, and that's just not the way they're thinking of this. One of the tools that they created that really was disparaged by both every party, I've heard it disparaged by defense attorneys, disparaged by, we'll say, members of law enforcement, and, just everyone across the board, was focused on written words and focused on PDFs and sorting through that information. That's just not what the reality is. They need really good video processing capabilities, and just not what they're able to do.
In that vein, though, one of the things you wrote about in the book, to a degree, was the unpreparedness, not just technologically, but there was this massive cleanup done at the Capitol that removed an extraordinary amount of physical evidence because people were just sort of, what do we do next? And Congress wanted to come back in. They wanted to remove the evidence of the attack right away, clean up, get the building looking like the Capitol again, and that led to evidence, probably crucial evidence, being moved or removed that may never be recoverable, or certainly wasn't. What did you make of that, and why did you mention that in the book?
I just thought it was it's one of the I completely get the instinct to just clean this up, right? But that was a massive crime scene, and when you have literally the next morning, the scaffolding company out there looking at the damage, and then people going around with blowers, dusting all the evidence away and stirring up all of the sort of pepper spray that had settled down. It just was, that should have been, much better documented and analyzed. And the case that this came up on, or it's come up in multiple cases, but one of them was someone threw some sort of grenade or something into the tunnel. It was some sort of explosive device into the tunnel, and they didn't have anything to analyze on what it was because they didn't pick up all of those pieces of material. So you would never had a situation like this. I think it was mostly because Congress was let's clean this up. I think that's who was directing it. The FBI was, not in full control of the scene at that point, even though they probably should have been more. And there was this thing to we need to get democracy back on track here. Right. But it really did, a lot of this evidence was just lost, where you had people throwing things in the trash can and cleaning up as quickly as possible that what could have been valuable evidence down the line.
And one of the defendants, was a Swedish scarf, was the nickname. I think wasn't that one of the pieces of evidence that either was removed or was discovered later somewhere?
Yeah. And a trash bin somewhere, right? It's that scarf is one of only 700 in the world or something. And that was actually Sergeant Gannell. He sent me some of the photos that he took after the Capitol attack, including the damage that was done to his hands. But he was that was the moment when he was looking for Roseanne Boylan's identification, and actually found it on the ground. It had been sort of lost there, and that's how they actually figured out this is who Roseanne Boylan, who sadly died on January 6th, was. But that was one of the photos that he snapped. And, there's a bunch of weapons there, too, right? And, that's really important when you're talking about especially deadly or dangerous weapon enhancements. When it comes to that point, those evidence and what that material actually was is really essential. And that's not something you can necessarily always determine from a video.
You mentioned Sergeant Gannell. You talked about Officer Fanone, the MPD. You've talked to them over the years. You talked to them for this book. What was do they know the sleuths? Are they bystanders? What do they think of the sleuth's role in helping solve the crimes that were committed against them?
I think in public, Gannell has acknowledged that he's talked to the sleuths. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there's some relationships there, which Gannell is going into all of his videos that happened that day, and really sort of because he didn't have a body camera was the big thing with him. So he's really like everywhere on January 6th. He's in so many of these fights and was assaulted so many times. And he really has to piece it together because the Capitol Police didn't have body cameras. With Fanone, it's sort of easier. Here's my entire experience, front to back, recorded. Sure, you can get other pieces of evidence from elsewhere and, that sort of thing. But, when you have someone assaulting you to your face, that's going to be documented, right? Their face is going to be captured, or a piece of their clothing is going to be captured, or something about them will be captured and documented. Whereas, Gonellis has to piece all of this together. And I don't think I'll speak more broadly, not just him, but I think that there are some frustrations about the support that they've gotten, from necessarily following up victim impact things. Like, there's been situations before where he's had to, or Gonellis specifically has had to ask for, to make a comment at this sentencing or something. Like he'll get blindsided, and I'll send a tweet, and then he'll be like, "Oh, this guy's he was involved in this assault," but they didn't know that sentencing was happening and that sort of thing. So, it's a really complicated sort of bureaucratic nightmare to handle all these things. I don't envy anyone who's charged with organizing this inside a really sort of antiquated system. But, it's pretty clear to me that there needs to be a shakeup.
Well, maybe this is the answer to the question. We're running out of time, but I wanted to ask you what surprised you the most in the course of researching this book and putting this book together. Like, what did you learn that you didn't expect to, or what was your number one takeaway, I guess, after this whole massive project?
One thing that really clicked for me that I don't think I really registered was how Trump's efforts to sort of use the Justice Department to overturn the election really just so fundamentally overlapped with the lead up to January 6th. I don't know if I just sort of missed that, but this showdown that we had in the White House, where Jeffrey Clark was supposed to be installed as Attorney General, or was saying he was going to take this job. There was this huge face down with all these Justice Department officials. That happened on Sunday night, on January 3rd. And actually what had happened just before that was that there was an important conference call talking about January 6th. It was I think 1 p.m. on Sunday afternoon, right before the acting Attorney General of the United States and the acting Deputy Attorney General of the United States got on that call. They talked about how Jeffrey Clark had just told them that he was going to take the job, and that was it, right? He thought he was the acting Attorney General of the United States thought he was going to be fired via tweet. The acting Deputy Attorney General of the United States went into his office, started taking things off of the wall, boxing them up, getting ready, because that was it. They thought that they were at the end of the line. So you might say that they're a little bit distracted in the lead up to January 6th, especially when they just lost this critical tool, the FBI just lost this critical tool that was monitoring all of this. There was just a lot of chaos, and I think that chaos had to distract from what was happening on January 6th. Because just imagine you spend a late night at the White House in something that would have been something for the history books. Like that was effectively the Saturday Night Massacre, same sort of deal. That was like democracy on the line. And then, you roll into, next morning, Monday, with, and 48 hours late, and within 48 hours, there's going to be a massive attack on the Capitol. Right. It's just, there's no one who could handle that sort of pressure, and just dealing with the bureaucracy. You're getting hit from all sides with that. And I think that was something that I really didn't necessarily click for me until I was sort of deep into the book, is just how that really was such a distraction in these critical moments leading up to January 6th.
Well, unfortunately, we have to leave it there, but remarkable achievement, Sedition Hunters, How January 6th Broke the Justice System. Incredible book. Honored to read it and join you today, so thanks for doing it.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This was great, and I'll see you in the courtroom soon.
Thanks for listening to the Afterwards podcast. We want to make sure you know about our latest podcast, Books That Shaped America. It's a companion podcast to our 10-week television series of the same name. We've teamed up with the Library of Congress and selected 10 books from across American history that have had a major impact on our society. Each week, the C-SPAN television program will focus on one of these books and its impact. This companion podcast will give you more background on the book's authors. If you want to learn more about Books That Shaped America, go to our website, c-span.org. The podcast is available wherever you get your podcasts.